Great. So I am delighted to welcome you to today's program, the Roz M. Perry Lecture, Sovereignty, Nationhood, and North American Indigenous Art. My name is Linnea West. I work in public programs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. With gratitude and humility, the Philadelphia Museum of Art recognizes Philadelphia as part of Lenape-Hokink, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. A long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements displaced many of the Lenape from this land. We strive to understand our place within the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to Lenape people and their vibrant communities today, including the federally recognized nations, Delaware Tribe, Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to Lenape ancestors past and present by committing to build a more inclusive and equitable space for all. For today's program, we are joined by two incredible writers, thinkers, and curators who will be discussing ideas of sovereignty, nationhood, Indigenous art, and histories, a constellation of thoughts through which we might reconsider what American art is. We are joined by Jami Powell, a curator of Indigenous art at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth College. Jami is a citizen of the Osage Nation and has a PhD in anthropology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research examines representations of Indigenous people in museums, as well as the interventions contemporary Indigenous artists make. Powell has published widely and is currently working on a book manuscript titled Stitching an Osage Future, Aesthetic Resistance and Self-Representation. And among other projects, Jami was also an advisor to the PMA on our new early American galleries. And so we are grateful to have you back, as it were.
Thanks for having me.
We are also joined by Jolene Rickard. Welcome, Jolene. It's great to have you.
Hello.
Jolene is Associate Professor in the Department of History of Art and Visual Studies and the Director of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program at Cornell University. Her research and artistic practice focus on contemporary Indigenous art, materiality, and eco-criticism with an emphasis on Haudenosaunee aesthetics. She's published widely as on the editorial board of American Art, the Otsego Institute, and is part of the Initiative for Indigenous Futures. She co-curated 2 of the 4 inaugural exhibitions of the National Museum of the American Indian. Jolene is from the Tuscarora Nation, Turtle Clan. So I'm just going to take a few more minutes of your time to set the stage for Jami and Jolene before passing it over to them for a discussion that will last about 35 minutes. We're saving time at the end for your questions and really look forward to hearing your thoughts as well. So a couple notes about today's program. Please use the Q&A box for your questions. It has a helpful upvote feature. So if you see a question that you like and you want to hear answered, click the thumbs up button. It'll go to the top of the queue. And those are the questions we'll answer first when we open it up for Q&A. The chat is open and people are saying hello and where they're tuning in from there. Hope to hear from all of you. Closed captioning is available. You can turn the CC button on or off for those. And finally, the program is being recorded. Tomorrow, we're going to send a follow-up email that has a link to the recording and any other links we share in the chat. So you can refer back to those. So this year's Roz M. Perry Lecture is organized in conjunction with the new Early American Galleries. And I'm just going to share a link in the chat to that so you can look up more if you like. Right now I put up an installation view. This is if you were walking into the first gallery, what you would see. It features portraits of Lenape leaders by a Swedish artist named Gustavus Hesselius. And below them is a case which contains a wampum belt. And we're going to have time to look more closely at these objects. But I wanted to show you this installation view because you can really see that one emphasis in the reinstalled galleries is the presence of Indigenous peoples, particularly the Lenape, on these lands from well before the first interactions with settlers through the time span the galleries cover, which is roughly 1650 to 1850. And so knowing that this was in the works back in 2019, I had invited Jami and Jolene to have a conversation at the museum that would respond to this planned reinstallation. Originally, we envisioned that they would come to Philadelphia, they would see the reinstallation, and then that would inform a conversation we would have in the auditorium. That, obviously that didn't happen because of the pandemic. Both the reinstallation and this talk were pushed back until now. So here in this slide and the next few slides, I'm just going to provide a sense of how the new early American galleries really shift in emphasis and tone around Indigenous narratives, and that hopefully will open it up for Jami and Jolene to have a big picture conversation around the impact and the complexities of integrating Indigenous narratives and objects into galleries of American art. So if you were entering the galleries, even before you saw that, you would see this. Another new aspect is that there's a land acknowledgement sign. You might not be able to read it very well on the slide, but it's what I read at the beginning of this program. And so the museum is recognizing that the lands we are on are the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. And so this emphasis kind of right from the beginning for the visitor is on Indigenous peoples and histories, and it feels different than how one used to enter the early American galleries. You can see some views of the previous installation here. And just to detail a little bit of what you're seeing, on the top left, there's Edward Hicks's Peaceable Kingdom painting. And then on the other side of the little maquette statue, there's a detail. Yeah, on the other side of the statue is one of the portraits of Lenape leaders by Gustavus Hesselius that's now on view when you enter. So the Hesselius portrait found its pair and is now prominently displayed when you first enter the new early American galleries. Meanwhile, the Peaceable Kingdom is now on view in Gallery 107, chronologically kind of the last gallery of the new early American galleries. Altogether, I think this shift in tone and emphasis prompts a lot of bigger questions. What constitutes American art? How do we present historical narratives and objects by Indigenous peoples? What does it mean to try and integrate these histories, particularly in a museum that hasn't collected work by Indigenous artists? And perhaps such questions carry a special weight when they are asked in Philadelphia, a city with such strong ties to the nation-building efforts of settlers to form what would eventually become the United States. So I'm really grateful that we have these wonderful speakers with us today to talk through some of the complexities at hand. And so all that said, I will pass it over to Jami and Jolene.
Thank you, Linnea, and to your team at the PMA who have worked to create space for this discussion and an opportunity for Jolene and I to grapple with questions alongside one another that our colleagues in museums across the country are currently addressing. I am pleased to be joining you today from Indakana, the unceded and ancestral lands of the Abenaki peoples. As Linnea mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be part of a group of folks who were consulted around this reinstallation project. And the image that you are all seeing on your screen now, as Linnea shared with you, used to exist at the entry space for the early American galleries. And this was a piece that really drew my attention in those conversations with the curatorial team. So this work by Edward Hicks, who was a Quaker minister and decorative artist, who actually created 62 of these Peaceable Kingdom paintings. This particular depiction that was previously located at the entrance to the early American galleries imaginatively illustrates a passage from the Old Testament book of Isaiah and entangles this biblical prophecy with William Penn's treaty with the Lenape in around 1682. The text along the border of the image reads, "The wolf did with the lambkin dwell in peace, his grim carnivorous nature there did cease. The leopard with the harmless kid laid down, and not one savage beast was seen to frown. The lion with the fatling on did move. A little child was leading them in love. When the great Penn his famous treaty made with Indian chiefs beneath the elm tree's shade. So for Hicks, who, as I mentioned, was both an artist and a minister, this image depicts what it looks like to put into practice the values of brotherly love and peace. Here in the foreground, depicting the lion with the little boy, the wolf laying alongside the lamb. However, the William Penn honored the treaty, but his successors did not. And the actual kind of imagery that is depicted in the background is largely fictional. The background was likely informed by an iconic painting by Benjamin West, Penn's Treaty with the Indians, which was commissioned by William Penn's son, Thomas, at a particularly contentious moment in the Penn family's history, but also at a contentious moment within American history as well. So this depiction of this interaction that happened, or the actual signing of the treaty that happened in 1682 was followed in 1737 when the Penns defrauded the Lenape of what is estimated to be over 1 million acres, which contributed to the decline in relations between the Lenape and settlers that had far-reaching consequences. So, you know, the recontextualization of this work and the movement of this work from the entry gallery, where the idea of history beginning at this, you know, particular moment, or Philadelphia's, you know, history beginning in this particular moment has shifted. And, you know, this work has often been framed as a parable, and I think to some extent still is within educational contexts. And I would argue that this work and works like it depicting this exchange are more akin to propaganda. And so I'd like to pose this question to you, Jolene, or these two questions. What's at stake when representations like this one are presented within museum spaces that are widely considered to be neutral by the general public? And does this erode the sovereignty of Indigenous nations? Oh, Jolene, you're muted. Gets you every time. Me too.
Sorry. Thank you, Jami, for this provocative opening. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to the PMA staff, in particular, Linnea and Greg, for facilitating this Zoom dialogue. I think that, you know, there are a couple thoughts that I'm having about this question, in that I'm not sure within the field of American art how many scholars in the field are thinking about Indigenous sovereignty as a critical dimension of the field. And then for the layperson or the person who enjoys going to museums as a way of expanding their knowledge, is there enough information within the context of the museum to actually embrace the subtlety of the shifts that I think a number of museums are making at this critical moment in time? And so the area, or the area of history that we're talking about, is about the formation of the United States. And within academia, the language of settler colonialism or settler state has surfaced as a way of signaling the ongoing unresolved relationships between original inhabitants or indigenous peoples and arrivants, newcomers, immigrants, or what are constructed today as settlers. And so people there may be a wide understanding or perhaps no understanding of just that terminology. So I thought it was important to at least share the language that we use today in order to talk about this space. And so the language of sovereignty is also really complex as it relates to American Indian, Native American, and Indigenous peoples in the Americas, and in particular in North America. And so all of those terms, I think, are continually in play, and the use of sovereignty may trip some people up because they only understand sovereignty from an inherently European hierarchical perspective. And so the first thing that we need to articulate is that Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, have appropriated that term or language and appropriated it at a period of time when there was a need to establish themselves more firmly as in nation formations in order to argue for our continuance. And so it's interesting because there isn't a fine line or date assigned to when the term sovereignty began to emerge or how it was used. But I think it was with us since very early contact, but it then took on momentum and different meanings in the early 20th century. And I use the early 20th century as that marker as a contemporary or modern notion of sovereignty as it's used by Indigenous communities. And so just the use of, so all of this by way of saying that the use of that term is really complicated, and it does not represent or does not mean a European hierarchical application of that idea within our communities. The use of the term sovereignty signals an attempt at getting and reaffirming the idea of Indigenous peoples as having their own nations. And so, the use of the language of nation is even complicated within Indigenous communities or amongst Indigenous peoples. And so we're caught in this kind of, complexity of English language. And so the spatial organization, the spatial geopolitical organization of Indigenous peoples is appropriating the use of sovereignty as a way of signaling nationhood is the way in which we are discussing it today. And so all of that to say, in the arts, we actually need to understand these things to actually have a deeper reading of why certain objects or artworks, in this case, in this gallery, are set in dialogue. And so I think your question also clarifies or begs the awareness that, we do recognize museums as public sites for education. And so within that space, what I think I recognize in the gestures made by the PMA in this exhibit, and I'm sure, Jami, with your guidance as well, that there is a concern that we begin to rethink not only the role the museum plays in its relationship to its many publics, but also in this case, the role the museum can play or an installation can play in rethinking the formation of the United States, but also the relationship to Indigenous peoples at that moment. But then how do we articulate or understand that moment in relationship to what we experience now. And so it's complicated, right? Because Indigenous peoples are still present, although in order to understand the space of Philadelphia, we need to understand the notion and historical fact of dispossession, and we need to understand the diaspora of the Lenape or Lenape people. And so all of that is linked to, I think, your question.
Yeah, and even just listening to you speak, I'm, reminded of the kind of interdisciplinary scholarship that, we both use within our work to arrive at these conversations where we're drawing on, not only art history, but history, political theory, visual studies, the work of artists themselves. And, as I was researching some of the works for this, I realized how shallow my knowledge is of the history of this place, and the kind of the site specificity that's so important within this work, reveals how complicated these conversations are. And just, I think as you were discussing, we discussed in a previous conversation, that the Lenape were not the only Indigenous peoples with relationships to Philadelphia as a place. And that if we then broaden that to think about the context of Philadelphia as, this space of emergence of, US nationhood, that there were delegations coming to this place. And I think that is something that there's an article that I think we wanted to put into the chat for folks. Some research that Marge Bruchak is doing around Wampum. And I think, Jolene, you're better equipped to talk about the Wampum than I am.
Well, it's interesting if we could, Craig, if you could just tile back one slide, please, maybe two, there. And so what's interesting is we have two Lenape portraits set in dialogue with a wampum belt. And like sovereignty, I think wampum is another one of those things that opens up a huge opportunity to understand why the significance of putting this in, what is significant about putting these objects in dialogue with each other in a museum setting. And so, wampum has erroneously been misunderstood as having some kind of only financial measure. But in fact, it's something that is much more profound in its own materiality. I mean, for the Haudenosaunee, wampum is actually part of our beginning story. And so it sets up a dialogue for understanding our relationship to the materiality of the bead. But in this case, the wampum is also an opportunity to understand this space of Philadelphia and most spaces in the Northeast as sites of critical diplomacy. And so I think that this exhibit creates a wonderful opening to actually open this discussion up further, because I would argue that we can't really fully appreciate the category of American art unless we begin to understand its interconnection to Indigenous space, both geographically and politically. And the wampum, I think, is the actual material evidence of this diplomacy. So if we could go to the slide on the wampum, please. And so the Quakers had a big impact in Philadelphia as mediators or negotiators of diplomatic space between Indigenous peoples and emergent stakeholders in the formation of the American government. And so all of this, of course, is predicated upon the dispossession of Indigenous peoples of our lands in violent terms, in actual removal of Indigenous peoples from these spaces, and then a kind of rewriting of this history. And so if we go back to this initial moment, there was a recognition at this period of time of the autochthonous spaces of Indigenous peoples and governance. And that's what has been recognized in wampum belts, in these relationships. Wampum belts are in some ways documents of these kinds of what we would like to think of as at that period of time of looking across cultural divides and recognizing Indigenous peoples as equals, as being empowered within the space of early America in this moment of formation. And so, this idea of friendship is, signaled in this belt. And in the chat, the link that was established, the link that was provided based on the wampum reports that Professor Bruchac posts around her research, she shared with us a photograph of an enactment of friendship that took place in 2015 between the title holder, Sid Hill, who holds the title of Tadadaho, which is, of course, a significant figure amongst the Haudenosaunee, and a descendant of the Lenape people, in that it marks this, continued friendship. And so this brings up, I think, not just a discussion about wampum, but it brings up about a couple things. For me, Jami has pointed out that in order to do this work and curatorial work or academic work, the new direction is to actually work intersectionally, to actually bring together a number of different disciplines in order to understand any of these ideas. So, sort of intellectual multivocality. And then another aspect of this is that when we adhere within the field of art history to strict periodization, I think sometimes we lose the opportunity to actually contextualize an ongoing presence of indigenous peoples. And so that's, I think, a difficulty of all early American exhibits. It's that there is the possibility that it can leave the public with the idea that there are no longer indigenous peoples here, or what happened to the people that were here. And so this single photograph, I think, just really reconfirms this connection to this moment in history as being an ongoing, it's about this ongoing relationship that I think, maybe we could argue that this exhibit today is seeking to, is it rekindle or extend, or the exhibit is opening up a space to actually begin to rethink this relationship. And so, in that way, and exhibits can play a critical role, I think, in any community, is that it can do just what it's doing right now. It opens up space for this discussion. And, the actual object provides us with the opportunity to have that discussion. And so I'm seeing in chat, there's some questions about the materiality of the bead of wampum. And, I would have to say that that really isn't what our focus was today. And that I think that, the work of Professor Bruchak has excellent website, as well as George Hamill's Wampum Chronicles, for really looking at the question of materiality.
Jolene, what you were talking about as the kind of space that this exhibition opens for this conversation, but also, the potential for other conversations, I think is so important, as many institutions are creating land acknowledgements and working with Indigenous advisory committees, or reaching out to scholars to help them think through how they might present this work. It's important to note that much like sovereignty, it's something that must be exercised, and that the ways that it is exercised can change over time, and that it needs to be specific to an institution and their collections. And so I did notice one comment in the chat or the Q&A about the, kind of starting in this moment around 1682, but also with the portraits by Hesselius, if you could go back to those as well, in thinking about kind of the specificity of the collection here, but also that the wampum belt isn't part of the collection of PMA. It's a work that's been loaned, and that has an interesting and complicated history as well. And I believe there is a label about it in the gallery spaces, but it talks about how in the 1930s, there was a decision by the museum to kind of move the ethnographic collections that didn't really fit within the collection, that they were moved in the 1930s to the University of Pennsylvania, the Penn Museum. And so thinking about kind of the conversation about what is art, and something that I think, people in our field say, oh, we're past that. I don't think we're ever going to get past that conversation within Native art, this kind of division between, ethnographic works and art, but also that, thinking about works as art alone is also very limiting. So in the way you were talking about wampum as, a marker of this diplomatic legacy, but also as connected to, creation stories and, these deeply meaningful ways that these works are connected to communities, putting it in a display case in a museum and calling it art already flattens the kind of life of that object. And so thinking about these two works, and I think that comment about, I wanted to bring that up, but I actually haven't spent as much time looking at these two works. I don't know if you did, Jolene, but I'm interested in kind of the bag hanging on this gentleman's, the pouch that has a clay pipe coming out of it.
Mhm, mhm.
Oh yeah. But also kind of thinking about portraiture of this period. These works were created in about 1735, before the walking treaty that I mentioned earlier, during negotiations with William Penn's sons. And these two Lenape leaders were part of that delegation. These are representing the peoples who exist or who were, in that space, but is still mediated in a particular way.
Yeah, yeah. So, so there's a lot to unpack, I think, Jami, in your observations. This broad category of art, I do think we are questioning, is the category broad enough to actually incorporate the expressive culture of Indigenous peoples? And I think that you're correct, that although some would argue the issue of ethnographic objects becoming art has been resolved, I think these categories are going to continually transform, and our understanding of them will continually transform. And so what is almost an antiquated term, I would argue people what would refer to paintings as a kind of plastic arts, but this idea of two-dimensional forms as signaling art and other things not signaling art, it's very easy in contemporary art to apply all kinds of experiences in this category of art. But we seem to get tripped up when we are looking at older works. And so the language, it's interesting to introduce the language that people used to discuss these things previously, that they're utilitarian objects or objects of use. And I would argue the aesthetic for Indigenous peoples was seamlessly enmeshed with almost everything within Indigenous cultures of what we know at contact. And so there was, there certainly was an attention to, principles of beauty and style and those terms that we think of as artistic terms. But there was also an additional demand that these things were also in use. And so in this particular period of time, some people would argue that perhaps the wampum would like to conflate it or create a direct line to wampum equals treaty. But I don't think we should do that. I really think that we should actually work to understand what wampum was and is, and how it functioned and how it continues to function, because it's a living, it's a living being, and by that I mean there's ideas that are coming, that have emerged within the field of Indigenous studies, Native American and Indigenous studies, that really help us to get a hold of these ideas. And so the idea that human beings have a relationship to all things, all living things, that are, beyond human beings, or things that aren't human, is a kind of principle or an understanding of relationality that some people are describing as kin, other people are describing as ontologies. I mean, there's a lot of, disciplinary, bumping into in terms of how do we understand our relationship to that wampum. It's been described as a mnemonic device, something to aid our memory, but that's just a little piece of it. And so there's actually a more profound relationship to an understanding of the wampum as a living being. And so so it requires, I think, and I do think this work is going on in the field, it requires an expanded understanding of what is art. And it requires new ways of framing and discussing, what we think of as materials. And so there's a whole discussion about materiality that is also attended to this. And so when we set those things within the dialogue or the field of American art, I think that what it suggests to me is that there's a lot of that there is, I think, an important challenges to the way in which the field is framed. And part of, I think, this exhibit will contribute to, I think, potential critiques around rethinking the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the formation of the United States, which I think the site of Philadelphia certainly has purchase on, and then how we read the specific objects within that discussion. And so, you ask about the clay pipe in this, and so since I haven't examined the original object, I can respond in two ways. So that particular pipe could be made by Indigenous peoples, but it also could have been traded and brought in as a trade item because of the way it looks. It could very easily have been of a European manufacture. And the time period of the painting would suggest that it's possible that it could be one or the other. But what we do know is that once some of these objects were introduced, there was a marked decrease in the production of ceramic objects in the Northeast. And so again, it would just require, so just to answer that specific question, I can't give you a definitive, what is that? But the pipe, I think, is a really significant symbol in this painting because of the role that smoking tobacco played in diplomatic negotiations. And so the fact that the pipe is prominently featured in this, I think, is a significant element of the painting.
Yeah, and that those diplomatic relations too, I think even just using terminology like diplomacy as we're engaging in these conversations is a shift for some people. I think that the importance of kind of engaging in close looking at these works with the kind of historical understanding of when these were taken, who commissioned them, right? Like that, that where's the money coming from is always an important question to ask, I think, when you're in a museum space, but also, to think about like what version of the story are they telling? Yeah. That it's impossible to ever understand fully these moments, but what you were saying about kind of understanding the multiplicity of interpretations and understandings and not trying to fit any of these works or their interpretations into a solely Western frame is something that museums are becoming more and more comfortable with. Yeah. And I think it's providing opportunities to at least acknowledge complexity. I think there's still a lot of work, speaking as a curator myself, that we have to do in order to really grapple with complexity in these spaces and to invite audiences to engage in those difficult conversations with us. But it's certainly an opening to think about how we might do this work.
And I think one of the biggest challenges for all museums and for Indigenous scholarship in this particular era or period is the inclusion of women's voices, because because of the way in which the colonial gaze has basically engaged primarily with men, Indigenous men, and not really focused on Indigenous women, has left us with the challenge of surfacing women's voices in all of these discussions. So I don't think we can forget about that either in all the work that we're doing. So I see that Linnea has rejoined us. Yes,
I've rejoined you, and I hate to jump in just when you started such an interesting new line of thought, but I did want to have time to answer some of the many great questions in the chat. And for those of you out there, if you do have a question that you want to ask, now is a good time to put it in the Q&A box. Thank you both so much for leading us through so many great trains of thought. I will just start us off with a question from Catherine Fernstam, who asks, how would this exhibition concept be presented in a Native-owned museum? Would it be? It seems to me that Native museums should be part of this conversation.
Jami, do you want to jump on that one?
I mean, you've actually worked at NMAI, so I think you have more experience than I do in working within these spaces.
Well, I mean, it's a big question. So thank you for the question. Yes, the National Museum of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian really did take on this broader question of what could be done, or what would be done, or what was done from an Indigenous perspective. And I think that the inaugural exhibits, which I was a part of, along with Gabi Tayak and Paul Chet-Smith and a number of other talented curators at the museum, asked some of these questions. And there was a critical reception of the particular framing that the museum took by both Indigenous scholars and non-Indigenous scholars. So it's not easy work to do, but the centering of Indigenous peoples in the discussion, I would argue, would be what most Native museums do when it's a Native museum or an Indigenous museum. And sometimes these histories are, and then it's, typically, place-based, where they seem to be more successful. And so they, unlike NMAI, which was trying to take on and represent, hundreds of Indigenous communities across the Americas, I think you have greater success when you're actually focused on a particular nation or community, particular Indigenous nation or community. And so I've recognized, though, a particular formula, and I don't mean to describe it as a formula, but NMAI was deeply involved in the process of community consultation. And so this idea of community consultation seems to be the model for producing this work. And so in short, what we see is a kind of, okay, we need to share our beginning story. Then we need to talk about our longtime relationship to place, which I think, is often recognized from an ecological perspective and an archaeological perspective. And then we see this moment of contact, and then we see a kind of then contemporary experience. And so most Indigenous museums that I've seen, and I do take responsibility for trying to see as many as I can that open up, that have opened recently, like within the past 20 years. This is what I recognize as a particular pattern. And so, you know, perhaps we have to look at that as a form of like having to tell our stories in our way. And, you know, and if my my sort of checklist of what these galleries or museums are doing, telling our stories through our way begins with describing the worldview within the language of the people who are telling the story seems to be a central feature. And so in this exhibit, there is no Lenape cosmology or creation story or beginning story. So there's a critical difference right there. And so, yeah.
I think that bleeds really nicely into the next question, if you don't mind me
sure.
jumping with that. You were speaking about how there's not a Lenape creation story, for example, in the exhibition at the PMA.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a comment from an anonymous attendee, and this person thanks you so much for sharing your knowledge and time today. Could you speak a bit more to methods you have seen or practiced that approach historical cultural belongings in ways that problematize typical periodization? In other words, what kinds of curatorial or educational approaches help foreground ongoing Indigenous resilience, creativity, futures, even in predominantly historical exhibitions?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm trained, you know, what's interesting about me participating in any of these conversations is that I'm trained as an anthropologist, not an art historian. And so my approach to the work is often based on community generated understandings of work. And so I think that, you know, thinking about centering Indigenous knowledges and epistemologies within gallery spaces, and really framing kind of the different worldviews that are present when depicting similar things. And so I'm working on an exhibition currently alongside some of my colleagues called This Land American Engagement with the Natural World. And we have a section where we're pairing a tea set that was owned by Daniel Webster that has like silver, these kind of like filigreed leaves on the handles and depictions of flowers next to bandolier bags that have floral depictions of vines as well. And we're really trying to set up the kinds of understanding of what Jolene was talking about, the relationality with these non-human beings versus thinking about the land and non-human beings as extractive resources. And so how does that impact the way people are depicting or engaging with the natural world is one example of something that I've been experimenting with alongside colleagues.
Jolene, do you have anything to add or?
On if I've seen any kinds of curatorial
I'm thinking, Jolene, about your piece that was in Hearts of Our People, the artwork that you created.
Yeah, I mean, I've created a specific work that I thought addressed that, but I was thinking of other exhibits, and so I think that the exhibition, Cross-Border Beadwork in Iroquois Life, that I collaborated on with Ruth Phillips, Trudy Nix, and the Castellani Art Museum and the McCord Museum, was an example of looking at historic to contemporary and using the influence of the historic work as a guide to what contemporary works were then curated into the exhibit. And so I do think there are a number of exhibits that actually use this premise today as a way of demonstrating how Indigenous peoples continue to engage with their cultures. And so, so I think it's happening. I think there are a number of excellent exhibits actually that have been done that actually do this within an Indigenous framework. I think where we meet where I think the challenges are, it's that, you know, what comes first? Do we understand something when we see something? Can we see something from a new or different perspective if our thoughts have not been otherwise informed? And so when we see historic works, do we just continue to embrace them with the knowledge that we have? Or is it possible for us to actually learn something new by looking at this historic work without having a new context to understand it within? And so I'm going to argue that you need the new context, and that's what the exhibits are striving to do. They're striving to send the signal and provide that new context. And so I do think like something like this triad with these two portraits with the wampum, that it needs more in order to understand the context and understand the deep historical what's significant about this object what's significant about this object relationship. And so we teach people how to see in many different ways. And so in this case, the opportunity is provided, but the question, I think the challenge becomes, can the public see it without having more historical information? And not just historical information, but having like shifting, you know, beloved positions about what the formation of this country is all about. Because in this modest installation, I mean, that's the challenge, to really rethink the formation of the United States. And I'm not, you know, I mean, and that might not be something everybody's ready for. And so I think what I've observed this past year with the immense activist energy in North America around about calling out racism, and then looking at systemic structures of racism, one of the most complex dimensions of this is that it feels like, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, we're at least willing as a populace to begin to really unpack this. I think people are genuinely moved, but are they going to be also willing to unpack the deeper structure of colonialism? Because you can't really unpack racism in North America unless you unpack colonialism. And so within this modest installation, and modest in a good way, right? I'm not suggesting that it isn't incredibly rich and deep, but it's that it's, you know, it's restrained in its, you know, in its objecthood, right? 2 paintings and a wampum. And, but of course it gets, you know, I was going on about the effusive color because I really love the color of the gallery, and I congratulate the gallery for the museum for introducing color. I love it. But but the you know, because you know, when America comes to understand that the very ground that we all share now is really a site of a violent dispossession of the peoples who are still here. I mean, that's an awakening, right? If we can get to that point. And so I don't think most people will approach this installation and have that idea that, oh, that's what this installation is really gesturing towards. It's asking me to understand, you know, because you need to understand this installation with the context of the broader exhibit. And, you know, it's not simply a review of historic works, but it's asking us to rethink this moment in history. And so, I mean, I do think it's a challenge. And I mean, you know, all of the museum educators out there saying, oh, we do that work in our educational programming, right? But, you know, the marketing studies that I've been involved with museums, it's really a challenge because people zip through museums, and if they don't get the ideas in, you know, and you all know, most of you know this, people read headlines, they read subcaptions, they look at the object, and very few people actually read the deeper captions. And so we have to interrupt in some way the audiences or the public's relationship to these histories, really the work of the exhibition.
Yeah.
But it's difficult.
And of course, I mean, programs like these are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of opening up a conversation, but they are spaces and beginning points. And these are new galleries, and it's just the beginning of the work that the PMA, for example, will be doing in these spaces.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, it's easy to be the armchair critic after all this work has gone into this. I mean, I completely acknowledge that. But it provides us the opportunity to think these not provocative, but actually historical changes, right? And so it's very exciting to have an institution like PMA mount an exhibit like this, to have consulted so thoroughly with the Lenape diaspora in order to even create that relationship, to have called in a scholar like Jami Powell, who is actively curating and working on Indigenous visual culture all the time, and to bring her in to have these conversations. I mean, this is, you know, today I think the standard for what is required to do these exhibits, and I can't think of any category of art than American art that must practice this, because that's, you know, the place for the most ironically, I think it's the place for the most dynamic change, that we have to really rethink that early contact period in order to continue to unpack and unravel why, you know, why we still need to have activist movements like Black Lives Matter, because they're connected. And, you know, and so one would not automatically, I think that this installation is connected to that activism, but it's essentially connected. And I think that that's the, you know, there's so many opportunities in these exhibits exhibitions to actually help us to understand our contemporary experience. And that's what gets me excited, you know, how it affects us today. And of course, I also just am an object person, and so I can't help myself but get invested in the object.
No, I couldn't agree more. And earlier in a conversation, Jami spoke about critique as an act of generosity. And I just want to thank you both for your generosity in being here today and sharing this space with us and our audiences. We're already a little over 1 o'clock, a little past our time, as it were. And I wasn't worried about us not having enough to say. Thank you both so much for being here and being in this space with
Well,
us.
Well, thank you. And I hope you get to save the chat for us or the questions for us, because I didn't get a chance to read them all. But I really appreciate the audience taking the time to share their time with us today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and I will thank you both again. I will share our thanks to the Perry family, whose support for this annual lecture in memory of Rosa Perry makes today possible. Thank you all from wherever you're joining in for joining us today. We're really grateful to be able to share this space with you. I hope you'll have a chance to see the installation yourselves soon if you have not already. When we close this program, a survey will pop up. If you have any feedback, please share it with us. It helps us as we continue to develop programming. And we hope to see you all again soon. Our next program is next Thursday, June 4th. It's a conversation with Philadelphia artists Sharon Hayes and Jonathan Lyndon Chase. So thank you all so much. And I'm just seeing so many thanks in the chat, and Jolene and Jami, I hope you're seeing that as well.
All right. Yes. Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Be well.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.